All right, YouTube. Trump has decided to rescind much of the Obama-era environmental regulation with regards to climate change, CO2 emissions, oil and coal on federal land, among other things. I'm generally in support of this, and I'll try to explain why. I support environmentalism. I don't want to live in a dirty world. I do see the need for and the slow advance of green energy, and I see its advance as a good thing. I've weighed in on this before. Nuclear, okay, good stopgap measure. Eventually, solar, wind, whatever the hell else we happen to develop. Increasing efficiency, of course, is just as important as actually deploying energy production that doesn't, pollute so heavily. Fossil fuel is on its way out, and that's clear. But here's the problem. When you hold back infrastructure development for environmentalist purposes and reduce the efficiency of your infrastructure, you end up spending a lot more, which means you're taxing businesses a lot more, which means those businesses may not even have the money to invest in the kinds of technology needed to curb their emissions. They may decide that new filtration system that's 10% more efficient might be beyond their budget or something like that. There's an additional problem. When we stymie U.S. industry here, the industry doesn't magically go away. It simply goes to Asia or Africa or Latin America and countries with less environmental regulations. These Paris Accords, they're going to get cheated on all the time. They're not ultimately going to work. CO2 emissions will not fall, and in fact, they will rise. What happens? Like, let's say you have a major textile firm in the U.S., employs tens of thousands of people, produces all sorts of textiles. They're under environmental regulations. They can only emit a certain amount of pollution. They have filters, and they have to clean up and green up and all these other things. If you shut them down by putting more regulations on them so that it's no longer possible for that company to exist here, and we see this with worker safety and things like that have in some cases gone, I think, beyond common sense as well. The HR reps that they have to pay and so forth. That business doesn't stop being in business, it simply goes overseas. It goes to China. It goes to, India or something like that, where they don't care about environmental regulations as much. In fact, what you've done is you've increased the amount of pollution. You've simply put it out of sight and out of mind. There's another reason that I generally support this. Climatologists already say we're past the point of no return. In fact, we hit it last year, and now we're a bit beyond it. Which means that based on the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere, according to their best estimate, global warming will now continue regardless of human activity unless we went massively carbon negative. Since there's no possibility under the sun that that's going to happen, and because China's emissions alone are greater than all of the CO2 emissions in the world when anthropogenic climate change supposedly began. We're talking the late 1800s, dawn of the Industrial Revolution. There's no way to reverse it. I'm sorry, but if anthropogenic climate change is real, we're going to have to deal with the fallout from it and hope that nature itself can absorb that impact, wipe out part of the human population, and maybe the next time around after things heal, things get better. We'd better hope that there's some sort of feedback mechanism within nature to take care of the pollution that we produce. I am far more concerned about the trash, the flotsam and jetsam floating around in the Pacific, bags on the sides of the highways, nuclear waste and stuff like that, than I am CO2 emissions. I take a pragmatic approach. We can keep the world clean. One thing, none of these people, like Obama or anyone else, none of them ever want to talk about, what about we reforest people's lawns? People heavily irrigate in sometimes arid conditions. They have this immaculate green lawn. It's very, very pretty, to their standards. Not a tree there, not a bush there, nothing to really absorb readier amounts of carbon and store them for longer periods. Why aren't we encouraging people to do some backyard gardening? Start composting. Recycling's great, although the jury's still out on whether it's helpful unless it's specifically the reuse part of recycling. Why aren't we encouraging people to make biochar to offset carbon production? Why aren't we encouraging them to grow flowers and stuff for the pollinators and to hold more carbon instead of just, a monoculture of grass? Why aren't we encouraging these things? Why don't we crack down on the actual polluters, China and India namely, as well as Mexico now, Turkey, some of these other countries with rising industrial rates? They produce far more pollution than we do. U.S. industry is almost non-polluting compared to like China. We still produce a lot of CO2, but all these other pollutants, it's China, it's India. Southeast Asia is where it's at when it comes to industry, and it's because we've suppressed it here and in Europe. It's too expensive. And it has to do with globalism too. Something the leftists that'll come here and complain. Think about it this way. Under globalism, that stuff has to be produced. It's not going to be produced here. Those multinational corporations that fund people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, so-called environmentalists, even like Sanders, those same corporations will gladly put their factory up in China, and the Chinese don't care if it's spewing out black fumes all day. They don't care about worker protections. They don't care about minimum wage laws. They don't care about food safety. They don't care. They just want the industry there. They don't care if their cities are blanketed in smog. There's your problem. If you're worried about climate change, then your worry isn't Europe with all the windmills and solar panels going up everywhere, where people increasingly drive less and less, practically have to use a bike in some urban centers because they banned cars on the roads. And I think it was wasn't it Barcelona or Madrid or one of these cities banned cars entirely citywide within the entire downtown, make it one giant pedestrian mall. That's Europe or parts of the United States. I mean, our industrial belt, the Rust Belt, is literally a Rust Belt now. There's very little industry actually left there. Why don't we bring it back here where we can supply proper regulatory systems? Even the stripped back, scaled down environmentalism of the pre-Obama era, which is what Trump's actually returning to, guess what? This country already had the Clean Air Act. It already had the Clean Water Act. It already had environmental regulations. It already had worker protections. All these things that the left is now worrying about Trump rescinding, they're still going to be there. He's simply rescinding the newest layer of that regulation, which led to a continued decline of U.S. industry. He's not saying, oh, we're not going to have any environmentalism in the country. Oil everywhere, coal everywhere, drive whatever car you want, no regulations at all. It's not what he's doing. He's rescinding it to pre-2008 levels. We had already cleaned up our act into the 90s. We're 20 years past that already. Obama made new regulations, added climate change to virtually every piece of federal bureaucracy that we even have, and it's pointless. It's not actually going to reduce the CO2 emissions any further. It'll just destroy jobs. It'll raise CO2 emissions by putting them in China and India. I stand generally in support of this. I'm an environmentalist. I like solar. I like wind. I like green energy. I like composting and backyard gardening. But applying more bureaucracy to U.S. industry does not make the world cleaner. It doesn't reduce the world's CO2 emissions. You're the ones that claim globalism is great? Then look at the actual globe. Don't just look at U.S. policy. Think for a moment about what it actually means, and you'll realize it makes the world dirtier to send our industry abroad while making us economically weaker. That's about all. Peace out.